Happy holidays, everybody. This is my review of Far Cry 3 for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to Far Cry 2. It was developed by Ubisoft Montreal and released in December of 2012, and it's a pretty interesting game. When it was first announced, there was barely any fanfare for it at all. It was just basically, okay, we got one last game to show you at this year's E3, and then they showed this, and it pretty much blew everybody's minds. Because we kind of expected a Far Cry 3 to be made, but we didn't really expect them to just kind of toss it in there at the end and have it look as impressive as it did. Now, as it got closer and closer to release, they of course started building up the hype more and more. And when it was finally released, it got pretty much rave reviews across the board. So the question there is, did they learn from their mistakes in Far Cry 2? And even though I enjoyed Far Cry 2, it did have quite a few mistakes in it. Or did they do something else, or what? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it is very impressive. It runs on Nudity Engine version 2, which also powered Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon later on. But it's just a very impressive graphics engine that renders a very, very large distance. Now, keep in mind that the Nudity Engine version 1 powered Far Cry 2. And at that time, it was also very impressive for a number of things, including its vegetation and the way it simulated flames and that sort of thing. All of that returns in Far Cry 3, only they have enhanced it to take more advantage of DirectX 1011 effects. So, it looks a lot better than Far Cry 2 did, although it does still retain a lot of the visual cues that you would just see in Far Cry 2. Most notably, the art style is fairly similar. The difference being, this one is a lot more colorful. A lot more colorful. And it is so much appreciated that they got away from the brown and grey and railway steak crap that we're so used to these days, and actually made something that's vibrant and full of life. It's really, really nice. On top of that, it's fully decked out for the PC version, including such elements as the FOV slider, pretty much decked out options menu, with tons of settings to fill around with. Now, what you're actually seeing in this video is basically a mixture of high and medium settings, and I think part of why I don't get so good performance is that I have a dual-core processor. I think it's partly because my processor is technically under minimum spec. I have a 2.8 GHz processor. It says it requires a 3 GHz processor with AMD, so that's probably why I see performance issues. Although I have heard reports of it having stuttering issues even on more powerful systems, so it comes with a price, obviously. It's certainly playable, and you'll never really run into any really, really horrible frame rate issues where you just can't play the game. But just keep in mind that if you want to run this thing on higher settings, you're going to need a pretty powerful PC to actually do it well. Particularly because the draw distance is so large and there's so much rendering and so many physics to simulate and all that sort of thing. Now, apart from the graphics, they have pretty much top-notch sound design as well. The voice acting is very well done. Some of the accents are a bit campy and ridiculous, but for the most part, the acting in this game is actually very, very well done. Particularly from the villains. Most notably, of course, being Voss, who is voiced by Michael Mando, and actually also acted out by him, because they actually used motion capture for this game as well. And Mr. Mando does a phenomenal job as Voss. Really makes the character come to life, and not only does he make the character come to life, but he also makes him rather menacing and actually rather intimidating, partly because of all this very realistic acting and such that you're seeing in the actual game, as opposed to just seeing what might be clunky animations or something like that. It's certainly a big step up from the previous game, where pretty much everybody had a flat and lifeless voice, even though the acting itself wasn't really terrible. It just, they didn't really sound right. And this one they do sound right, even though some of the accents are just a bit cheesy and overdone. The sound effects are very well done across the board. All of the weapons actually sound rather beefy, so it gives them a very nice sense of firepower when you're sitting there mowing enemies down with machine guns or whatever. So you certainly feel like a badass firing the weapons in this game, even though they don't necessarily handle like they sound. And the ambient sounds and everything like that are also very, very well done. Make you feel like you're actually in a jungle or in the rather tribal society that you're seeing. And then there's the music, which is okay. It's pretty much what you'd expect going from their emphasis on tribal nature and such like that. And it works pretty well for the game, but it's just nothing particularly memorable. The trailers had more memorable tunes, but they didn't carry those over into the full game, so that's just something to keep in mind. Although they do have one that is a Skrillex song, which is played during one particular mission, and everybody seems to love that mission, even though I hated it for one particular reason, which is that it just was incredibly disorienting. But yeah, they do have that, so they do actually have dubstep in this game. Now, I'll admit that one use of that song was very appropriate, but dubstep, just stop with the dubstep while you've already got stuff that isn't dubstep. Let's put it that way. But other than that, the rest of the sound design is very well done, and the music works pretty well. But obviously what really matter are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as Jason Brody. He's pretty much a daredevil kind of character who, with a bunch of his friends and his two brothers, goes to Rook Island basically just to party and to do all sorts of tropical sport kind of things. And he and his friends get captured by Voss and his pirates, and they're being held for ransom. And Jason and his brother Grant actually escape, and Grant is killed in the process. So Jason ends up having to rise up to the occasion to actually rescue his friends and his remaining brother, and fight off Voss and the pirates, as well as later on when you find out who Voss's boss is, who is Hoyt, and you have to deal with him too. And the plot itself deals with Jason's descent into madness as he's doing all of this, and it ends up being rather psychedelic in a lot of ways. There's several sequences of this game that are just where you're kind of inside his head, and it tunes out everything but what he's specifically focusing on. It's got all sorts of crazy colors going on, really weird images, that sort of thing. And that's the kind of bits where you can see where Jason is going insane. And Jason himself isn't really that strong of a character. He's okay, but he just kind of whines the entire game. Eventually he gets better about it and becomes pretty much a total badass, but it's just weird having these bizarre contradictions throughout the entire game. Like, for instance, he starts out completely inexperienced with absolutely no desire to actually take anybody down, and yet he is perfectly capable of slaughtering hordes and hordes and hordes of bloodthirsty pirates, and perfectly capable of just taking dudes out left, right, and center, just no problem. And yet he's still freaking out about it later on in cutscenes. Whereas when you're actually running around blasting the pirates themselves, he doesn't really make a comment on it. It's just weird situations like that. It's not bad per se, but it's just an oversight that they probably should have done something about, and they just didn't. So his inexperience is really more of a plot convenience than actually expressed through the gameplay. And you get also some bizarre contradictions as well, like no matter how much you go hunting, every time you skin the animals, he will still go, "Oh, this is disgusting," and that sort of thing. So you just have these weird situations that arise from that. The actual plot itself loses steam toward the end of the game. When you actually get to the southern island, that's pretty much where the plot just takes a nosedive. And while it does have its moments toward the end and the action heats up, it seems more abrupt, like they just didn't develop that part of the plot as strongly as they should have or actually wanted to. and they had to rush it out to meet a deadline. It's certainly perfectly playable, but it just has these moments where you're just kind of like, this seems unfinished, or this seems undercooked, or something like that. And so, most of the plot is coherent, and it makes sense, but toward the end, it just kind of seems like they had to wrap everything up, and as a result, it suffers from that. But what about the gameplay itself? Well, the gameplay is a mixture of open world and missions. And these missions are what you complete for the story, of course, but you also get side missions, like going on specific hunting quests, or taking out certain enemies, any number of things. There's actually quite a bit to do, and so you have plenty of side missions to do, which will actually allow you to unlock new things, like you do certain side missions and you will get access to signature weapons, which are these specially upgraded versions of certain weapons that you may not be able to get the attachments for otherwise, and they have their own unique abilities and such like that. So stuff like that gives you quite a bit of incentive to actually go on these missions, and for the most part, they're actually pretty good missions. So it's nothing that's really going to bother you. You're actually going to have quite a bit of fun just exploring and finding new ways to do things and that sort of thing. The story missions themselves are actually very linear, which is to be expected, of course, and they'll have you going all over the islands and just doing all sorts of different things. There was 2 missions in the entire game where you're not allowed to actually take anybody out. And the latter of those was incredibly annoying, and I really had to rely on the actual checkpoints to allow me to actually complete the mission. It was extremely annoying. Now, once I got through that, it was fine, but getting through that particular mission was just ridiculous. And you actually see it in my How to Fail video of this. So it's just certain missions like that really just make the experience tank. But then the missions that are after it will bring it right back up, because then you're going off and, say, ghosting through a place, just taking dudes out left, right, and center, doing all sorts of crazy action hero kind of stuff. And all the while, you are free to roam about the island between missions. And so what you're going to be doing with those is not only the side missions, but you're also going to be liberating outposts, as well as finding radio towers. Radio towers function like the synchronization points in the Assassin's Creed games. It's just a blatantly obvious thing, where you have to climb up to the top of the tower, you have to disable the jammer on it, and then you get a big chunk of the map revealed, with all sorts of things that will show up on your map now. Frankly, that got kind of annoying, because it blacks out parts of your map, and so you're not really sure where you're going half the time, and sometimes actually getting to the radio tower is a ridiculous thing, because you're trying to get through mountains, and you have to go on specific paths, and you don't really know what the paths are because you haven't been there before. So sometimes that got really annoying. For the most part, it was fine. The towers themselves are pretty much just some basic platforming puzzles, and they could have been done better, but they could have been done a lot worse, let's put it that way. And when you actually get a tower working, it will also give you access to weapons for free in the stores. You do have a pretty wide selection of weapons available, from things like assault rifles and shotguns and pistols, the stuff you're used to in an FPS, to more interesting things like the flare gun or the flamethrower or the recurve bow. Stuff like that, which is actually pretty fun to use. And you'll find that being sneaky in this game is rewarded a lot. If you liberate an outpost, there's basically 3 ways to do it. The first is to remain completely undetected, trigger no alarms. And when you do that, you get 1,500 experience points. Yes, you can level up in this game. And that's how you get access to different abilities that manifest on Jason's arm in the form of the tattoo he has, actually. It's kind of a cool feature, but you get a large amount of experience points for liberating an outpost, basically ghosting it. You get less experience if you don't trigger any alarms, but you get noticed. And how you would do that is you disable the alarm, or you would take all the enemies out before they can get to the alarm, but they spot you. And they all come after you. And then there's the third way, where you get much less experience, and you basically just run in and just demolish the place, and you trigger the alarms. In which case you'll also have reinforcements coming in after you, so something to keep in mind there. Whenever you liberate an outpost, you now have a fast travel point. So you do have quite a bit of incentive to actually liberate these outposts. And you also get access to different side quests by actually liberating these outposts. So again, very useful. And most of the time you can actually just wander around the island and do pretty much whatever you want with that sort of thing. Just wandering around and just finding random dudes to fight with is actually surprisingly fun. The weapons in this game actually handle pretty well, and you get a nice sense of force behind them, although the recoil is pretty low across the board. And then, of course, there's just something really great about being able to pick off a pirate from half a mile away and just watch his buddies around him just freak out and run all over the place and never actually find you, and you just sneak off into the bushes and act like nothing happened. And unlike in Far Cry 2, the enemies in outposts do not respawn. So when you liberate an outpost, it is now full of friendlies. So they did fix that. They also fixed the weapon degradation system by removing it altogether. They probably could have kept weapon degradation in there, but it's fine when they removed it. They also fixed the malaria thing from Far Cry 2 by not having it in there at all. You don't have anything in this game that really hinders you per se, except for the leveling system, which honestly works fine. There may be certain abilities that you really want, but you have to unlock them by completing certain numbers of missions, or certain missions in general, or just getting a certain path to your unlocks. And they're pretty straightforward for the most part. It's all going to be useful to you, and by the end of the game you can pretty much have the whole thing unlocked. So it's nothing that you really need to worry about, but it is there. Now, there are some things about this game that just annoy me. The first of these is the crafting system. In theory, this is a great idea, and with regards to things like, say, crafting medicine syringes, it's perfectly fine. You use those to heal yourself, or you use them to give you special abilities, like being able to hunt better by being able to detect animals and stuff like that. That sort of thing is great. Having to craft additional weapon slots, having to craft additional ammo pouches, which will increase your ammunition, that got really annoying because you need certain types of resources to actually craft these things. Where do you get those resources? By hunting. And certain enemies, animals actually, are pretty hard to bring down, particularly the ones that you get at the end of the progression. For instance, the blood Komodo, which you're actually seeing in this video. And so it sends you off on these quests and gives you things to do, but at the same time it feels very grindy. And so that got really annoying. Now, once you get all of those crafted, you're fine, and you don't need to worry about it anymore. But just getting that stuff crafted to begin with was rather annoying. And once you get 4 weapon slots, it's not really a huge problem anymore, except for the ammunition. So they could have done that better, let's put it that way. There's also the multiplayer. The multiplayer in this game is awful. Not only does it run like crap, hardly anybody plays it anymore. And so it has this progression system, like in pretty much every other modern FPS out there, where you have to level up to get access to different weapons, and you have to level those weapons up to get access to the various attachments and such. Really annoying. I hate that kind of thing. So it's just blatantly unfair to new players, although what they start you with is fairly competitive for the most part. The weapons in this game are decently balanced until you get to the really high tier stuff, which will just take you out in 1 to 2 hits. So it's a bit of a mess. You also get different abilities, and there's a variety of game modes, but it's just really laggy. It runs like crap, and it's just not fun. So the multiplayer is something that will really let you down in this thing. There's also co-op, but I didn't play that, presumably for the same reason as just the normal multiplayer being really, really laggy and hardly anybody actually being around to play it. So what you're left with is a single-player open-world FPS, where it has some missteps here and there. It has a plot that's mostly coherent but loses steam towards the end and just kind of sputters out. You have a crafting system that's a decent idea but just doesn't work out all that well. FPS combat that is actually really satisfying, and despite being fairly easy to handle the weapons, is actually pretty challenging because of the enemies not being very stupid. Although sometimes they are, but mostly they're not stupid. A fairly wide variety of things to do for an FPS, and all sorts of things like that really do make it a very nice experience. Although you do also have things like, again, the crafting system and the multiplayer bringing it down, as well as the fairly large number of bugs that I found. For some reason the game liked to crash on me. I don't really know why, it just did. So if that's a common thing, then that should be noted, but if it's not, then, and it's just me, then I don't know. So ultimately, I found Far Cry 3 to be a very enjoyable experience that is in general an improvement over Far Cry 2, although it does have its own problems. It's by no means a perfect game, but I do highly recommend it. I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.